Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Lynn Robson. I am the Fellow in English at Regent's Park College, and I'm delighted to be with you today and to be talking to you about one of my favourite things to talk about, which is murder stories from the 16th and 17th centuries. These were an incredibly popular genre read by so many people, from the kind of highest in the land, aristocrats, scholars, right the way down to much lower down the social scale, people who had very limited means and maybe limited literacy. These pamphlets would be read either to oneself, or they might be read out to your household, with these entertaining stories of true crimes. So I want to share with you today one which is about Anne Green, and my lecture is called Murder, Myth and Medicine in 17th Century Oxford, making an example of Anne Green. And you can see on the slide the title page of one of these pamphlets that tells her remarkable story. In fact, what I'm going to be talking to you about today are several interwoven stories, but it really is Anne Green's story, the story of her life and her remarkable death, which is the thread binding all of the stories together. Now, there is some local interest here because the events that I'm going to be talking about took place in Oxford in December 1650, at the exact point of a remarkable century in British history, culture, politics, and kind of at a time when, after 8 years of civil war, we might begin to think about, was this a world in flux, or maybe even a new world which was coming into being at this time. And this slide captures that idea of a world, a new world, or a world in flux, a world that for the previous 8 years, finishing with the execution of Charles I in 1649, had seen sharply drawn animosity between the parliamentarians on the one side and the royalists on the other. As the execution of Charles I had happened nearly 2 years before the events that I am going to be talking about today. And since his execution, a new Commonwealth, a new republic had been established. Now, the placing of these events in Oxford in 1650 is particularly important, because Oxford was Charles I's headquarters during the Civil War, and the city authorities and the university had both been stalwart royalist supporters. Charles I himself had stayed at Christ Church during the Civil War, and his Queen Henrietta Maria had lodged at Merton College. Following the execution of Charles I in 1649, both Oxford City and the University of Oxford were required to subscribe to what was called the Engagement, which was passed on the 2nd of January 1650, and this was an oath of loyalty to the newly formed republic. Now, those who refused to subscribe from the university, any fellow who refused to sign the engagement was dismissed. And so at this point in 1650, the university was purged of over half of its fellows. Now, against this background of significant, deadly, life-changing events happening to both royalty and to the elite, and to the both social and also academic elite, we have Anne Green, who was a very ordinary woman. And yet, as you'll see as I tell you her story, she comes to exemplify so much that's significant about this precise historical moment. And I'm going to talk to you today about the different ways that her story was told. And this raises questions about who actually does own someone's story after all. Now, all of the stories, all of the versions of Anne Green's stories, um, engage with the idea of creating her as an example. And these are the kind of examples that I'm going to be talking to you about, the way that Anne Green is used. So on one side, we have the stereotype of the justly punished murderer, and this was something that had been circulated via murder pamphlets for at least 80 years before the events in Oxford in December 1650. Pamphlets that had at their heart a providential framework when it came to ideas of justice and criminality. And at this point in 1650 or in the 1640s, leading up to 1650, new media, new ways of circulating news and information are emerging. And Anne Green's story is also part of that development. There is also the idea of reliance on divine providence, understanding that God's will would work through the justice system. And again, we find ourselves at a moment of transition where an increasing reliance is being made on empirical evidence to prove guilt or innocence. And that, of course, as you will see, intersects with scientific developments that are happening in the University of Oxford at this precise time. And then we will go on to think about Anne Green as both a literary and a historical example as well. So let me begin just by introducing you to the main players in this story. So first of all, we have Anne Green herself. And as you've already seen, I've used the title page of the pamphlet. I'm using a kind of generic illustration here of a serving woman, of a domestic servant, because there are no contemporary images of Anne Green. She's far too unimportant to warrant anything like a portrait that could be handed down to posterity. She was born in Steeple Barton in Oxfordshire, and that's about 15 miles northwest of Oxford, a very small village. She was born around about 1628, and then she was employed as a servant in the household of Sir Thomas Reed. He was a former sheriff of Oxfordshire, and he lived in Duns Tew, which was about 3 miles away from Anne Green's home in Steeple Barton. After the events that I'm going to tell you about at the end of 1650, she married and had 3 children. Her employer, Sir Thomas Reed, died 3 days after a petition for her pardon was granted. The next person I need to introduce you to is William Petty. Now, William Petty was a physician. He studied medicine in Utrecht, Leiden, and Paris, and he set up a medical practice in the Oxford Reading area in 1646. And then late in 1649, he formed the very first self-conscious scientific club in Oxford. And the members of that club met at William Petty's lodgings at an apothecary's house in the High Street. Now, this club was known either as the Oxford Philosophical Society or the Invisible Society, and its members would become founders of the Royal Society in 1660. They contributed to the embedding of innovative scientific and medical research at Oxford, and Petty himself became Reader in Anatomy in 1650 and a Fellow of Brasenose College in 1651. He was only 29, and he was the beneficiary of that purge of the Fellows of the University that I told you about. And there's no doubt that his involvement with Anne Green also enhanced his medical reputation and certainly helped his career moving forward. In this portrait of him, you will see that his hand is resting on an anatomical textbook. It's Adrian van der Spiegel's De Humani Corporis Fabrica, which had been published in 1627. And he had a colleague whose name will also occur in Anne Green's story, and that was Thomas Willis, who at this time was a fellow of Christ Church. Now, Thomas Willis is particularly noteworthy in medical history because he was the man who discovered the circulation of the brain. And on this slide, you'll also see some of his anatomical drawings, so that you will already be understanding that the science of anatomy and advances in medical knowledge have something to do with Anne Green's story. So let me tell you her story. On a very cold, wet morning, on Saturday, December the 14th, 1650, Anne Green was hanged in the yard at Oxford Castle. 3 weeks after her condemnation for infanticide at the Oxford Assizes. She was 22 years old, and she'd become pregnant after having sex with her employer's adolescent grandson, Geoffrey, who was probably only about 16 or 17 at the time. Around 16 weeks into her pregnancy, which of course Anne had concealed, even if she knew about it, she delivered a stillborn fetus while she was overworking at turning malt for brewing. And she concealed the body of the fetus in a privy. Both she and the dead fetus were discovered, and after that discovery, she was swiftly arrested, tried, and condemned. Now, you might very well ask the question why that would be. And the reason was that although she pleaded not guilty at her trial, she was judged culpable under the terms of the 1624 Act to prevent the destroying and murdering of bastard children. This particular act was in force until the beginning of the 19th century, and it ruled that any single woman who concealed their infant's death would be presumed guilty of murder. And it is the concealment that is such an important thing here. And single mother doesn't just mean unmarried, it also means widow. It was arranged that after her execution, Anne Green's body would be used for anatomical dissection by the university's newly appointed Reader of Anatomy, Dr. William Petty. Now, using the corpses of criminals for penal dissection was a relatively common practice, but it was perceived as an additional degradation and punishment, and so was usually reserved for the most wicked criminals. Female corpses were rarely available for anatomical dissection, so this made Anne Green's body more than usually desirable to the scientists. And you'll see here this wonderful painting by Rembrandt that is a depiction of this newly emerging science of anatomy. Here's another illustration of an anatomical dissection, and what you'll see is this is a much more turbulent scene than the one that Rembrandt shows in his painting. And in fact, both of these illustrations together perhaps give you an idea of notions of display and curiosity. That was part of dissection. It was such a novelty as well. There had only been one other reader in anatomy at Oxford before Petty was appointed. Before climbing the ladder of the gibbet where she was going to be hanged, Anne Green made a final speech declaring her innocence, in which she spoke of the lewdness of the family in which she had lately lived. Her execution, carried out by an inexpert hangman, a fellow prisoner who had been let out of the chain put her to death, was a harrowing affair. Her friends and standers-by pulled on her legs and thumped on her chest to try and hasten her death, and a soldier struck her several times on the stomach with his rifle butt. After half an hour, her body was cut down and removed to that nearby apothecary's house, which I've already told you about, at 107 High Street, to await the attentions of Dr. Petty and his fellow anatomists, Drs. Thomas Willis and Dr. Clark. And you need to understand that the dissection was going to happen then and there in that apothecary's house. They weren't going to take her body somewhere else. It was the middle of winter, the ideal time for doing an anatomical dissection, when there is no refrigeration or ability to keep a corpse. So it wasn't only going to be the doctors who were going to gather there, but they would also have an eager and avid audience, as many of people as could get into that room in that house. Anne Green's body was lying in an open coffin, and as the men gathered around her, it was noticed that she was still breathing. And so Dr. Petty and his fellow physicians turned their efforts to reviving rather than dissecting her. And they treated her for about 11 days. After that, she made a full recovery, and she finally left Oxford to recuperate with her family in the country, taking her coffin with her as a souvenir. And during her recovery, she became, as you might imagine, something of a local celebrity, and the public paid to visit her. With the money that was raised, Anne Green was able to sue for a pardon, probably with William Petty's support, and that which was granted to her. In her petition, she admitted the foul and fearful sin of fornication, but maintained her innocence of murder. You'll be happy to know that Anne Green's story had a happy ending, insofar as she later married, and she had 3 children and died of natural causes in 1659. Now, as you can see, there's no doubt in all of this that Anne Green has been made an example of in the public operation of justice. According to the law, her apparent crime was fittingly punished. Had things gone according to plan, her corpse would then have provided an example of female anatomy, a real mystery at this time when the majority of corpses available for dissection were male. So the exploration of female anatomy, its workings and mysteries would have been exposed to the inquisitive gazes of the university's scientists and students, all of them, as you can see, again from this illustration, all of them men. However, the first printed reports of these events see things quite differently. The news of this remarkable occurrence, what came to be called this wonder of wonders, first broke to the world beyond Oxford on Thursday, the 19th of December, in the news book Mercurius Politicus, and here it is on this slide. Mercurius Politicus, as was other news books, were all published in London, and the report of what was happening may well have been sent by Petty himself. Now, news books were a kind of relatively new way of disseminating news around the population of Britain. Before the outbreak of civil war, it was illegal to publish domestic news in England, but when the Civil War began, the censorship system broke down, and so it was then publishers were able to print whatever they wanted. And of course, at a time of civil war, the population was hungry for news. So the news book is born, and it carries on. Obviously, once you've let the genie out of the bottle, you can't put it back again. And the news books, like the factions in the Civil War, the opposing sides in the Civil War, were politically determined. So during the Civil War, there would be parliamentarian and royalist news books. But of course, by 1650, what you are having is those news books which would be telling the news of the newly formed Commonwealth. And this particular news book opens with a warning against tyrannical rulers, followed by reports of the new model army's campaign in Scotland, which includes one from the army's commander-in-chief, Oliver Cromwell, and also the latest political news from Europe, from Antwerp, Brussels, Paris, and Venice, with an admission that the deadness of the season of midwinter makes it a slow news time. It also includes a report that the official account of the trying and judging of Charles Stuart, King of England, should be engrossed in a roll and recorded among the Parliament rolls. The notable report from Oxford about Anne Green, detailing a remarkable act of Providence, comes towards the end of the news book. The account is succinct and telling, and I just want to draw your attention to a few things in this account. First of all, that this is the one that forms the core of every other version of Anne Green's story. First of all, you can read the description of what was heard when they opened the coffin, and they heard a small rattling noise in Anne Green's throat, and then a lusty fellow standing by, thinking to do an act of charity, stamped upon her breast and belly, thinking indeed that he might finish her, might kill her, because the hanging had signally failed to be effective. However, looking at this from a 21st century perspective, we might think about this as something that actually saved her life. It was a very cold day. Anne Green had been hanged in her shift, which is her very thin undergarment, and she appeared to be dead. She was probably hypothermic, and so when her body was removed to the relative warmth of the apothecary's lodgings, it may well be that she began to warm up, and so she began to breathe, and her heart, which had never quite stopped, began to beat more effectively. And actually, by hitting her on the chest, this lusty fellow may have helped restart Anne Green's heart. And you can see the first things that were done to try and revive her. They opened a vein. So they bled her, they put her in a warmed bed, they found some kind of random woman to get into bed with her to use some body heat to warm her up. And then they employed other remedies to her head, throat, and breast. So much so, this was so effective that she spoke again within 14 hours. I think it's just to remind you that this room in which this dissection was going to take place was also the room where William Petty and his fellow ingenious gentlemen held their weekly meetings about natural inquiries and experiments. The other thing that's established in this edition of Mercurius Politicus is the consistency of Andrew Green's declarations of innocence. And the report that, unlike usual customs, there were failed hangings. It wasn't common, but it did happen. And usually, if there was a failed hanging, the victim of the hanging would usually just be taken out and hanged again. But in this story, it's recorded why she was reprieved. So, first of all, the governor of the Oxford garrison felt a sense of providence, God's providence working through this and reading these events as God declaring Anne Green's innocence. That was endorsed by the thousands of people who came to see Anne Green, despite the physicians trying to keep her away, and was finally endorsed. It's like almost like the sort of and it, as it says here, it's apprehended to be such a contrary verdict from heaven that may strike terror to the conscience of those who have been any way faulty in this business. So what we have here is this relationship between divine providence and medical skill, and trying to work out exactly who might be responsible for Anne Green's survival. And we can also add into that, obviously, public opinion, which is very important. And the questions that the idea of her reprieve brought about. Are there doubts being expressed about the judicial process itself? Why did she have to stand trial if God thought of her so clearly innocent? And finally, who has the power to decide guilt or innocence? And I'm going to try and answer each of these questions by looking at Anne Green's afterlives, at the different versions of her story, and the ways in which she is held up as an example to the fascinated and possibly prurient 17th century readers. Such was this fascination that not only did Mercurius Politicus publish an update on her recovery in its next edition, but very quickly much fuller pamphlet accounts of her story were published, so that in a few months readers had three similar but conflicting versions of the story. And here are the first two versions to be published, and you'll be familiar with this woodcut. And I just want to, this illustration that is used in both of these accounts, one called A Wonder of Wonders, the other a declaration from Oxford. They are very similar to one another, although a declaration from Oxford has a few more details in it, so it seems to have been published after A Wonder of Wonders. But I just want you to look at the woodcut itself, the illustration, which has been specially done for this particular crime. That didn't always happen. Printers very often just reused woodcuts from previous pamphlets. But you can see that this is a kind of cartoon strip approach to illustrating Anne Green's story. Bottom right, there she is kneeling at the bottom of the ladder before she climbs it to be hanged. You can see her hanging, one of the soldiers beating her on the chest, one of her friends or relatives pulling down on her feet to try and hasten her death. Then her being placed in a coffin, and finally a revival in a bed, being warmed up by that random woman whom they asked to get into bed with her, and the speech bubble declaring, "Behold God's providence." The fact that Anne Green's story failed to end with the expected execution and dissection meant that there was an imperative to try and explain these amazing events, but that was a very difficult task. Her fearful sin of fornication meant that her body had been criminally shamed by her pregnancy and her public execution in her shift. Shamed and criminalized, it was a suitable subject for anatomical exploration, becoming the property of the doctors planning to dissect her. However, her survival required explanation. If it was a sign of divine providence, then did the intervention of God wipe away both sexual and criminal shame? Was she restored to her life before she committed a sexual sin? As a revived and resurrected woman, what exactly was she? A miracle in a time when supposedly miracles no longer happened? Or was she an example of the power of the empirical world of science and rationality? Okay, so with those questions in our mind, now let's turn to think about this question of who exactly was responsible for her survival and what that effect had on questions about who had the power to decide her guilt or innocence. Let's turn first of all to a wonder of wonders. In these two pamphlets, Green is constructed as the penitent murderer, the central figure in these providential and fundamentally Calvinist stories. Her whole demeanour at her execution, praying and showing great comfort and undauntedness of spirit as she forgave her executioner and her false accusers, demonstrates the exact blend of physical passivity and active spirituality required of the exemplary penitent. Her reported first words as she revived from her death, "Behold God's providence," are so important that they, as you've seen, they were printed on the title pages. These words, as well as her willing acceptance of her death, prove her to be one of the elect and innocent of the charge against her, an innocence established through divine power and revelation and backed up, as we've seen, by the endorsement of some honest soldiers and the governor of the garrison, both undoubtedly parliamentarian, who forestalled any attempts to rehang her. However, what is also important in this is the skill of the doctors, of Doctors Petty, Willis and Clark. And here you see a description of it, but it is documented. But again, it is subsumed to divine action. There was a great hand of God in it, and having suffered the law, it was contrary to all right and reason that any further punishment should be inflicted upon her. And this kind of almost as though, I suppose, God is endorsing the work of and the great pains of honest and faithful Dr. Petty, who miraculously recovered her and whose actions then affected those who were involved in her story. And the enemies who were moved to wrath and indignation are, I'm sure, Sir Thomas Reed, who pursued Anne Green to prosecution and to death. So what we have here is a kind of the great man being vindictive, the honest soldiers who are much lower down the social scale, and the doctors themselves being responsible for Anne Green's survival and also directly doing God's work. The third version of Anne Green's story is called News from the Dead. And this is the last of the directly contemporary witnessed accounts to be published. There were two editions, which probably came out between March and May of 1651, so about 3 or 4 months after Anne Green's execution. As we've seen, her remarkable survival meant that she escaped becoming a subject of, or even subject to, anatomical dissection. However, escaping the knife of the anatomist doesn't mean that she escapes textual anatomization, and this is nowhere more apparent than in News from the Dead. It's divided into two parts. The first part is a prose account. The second is a collection of poems inspired by the events surrounding her trial, execution, and survival. The prose section tells the story that we're already familiar with, the detailed narration of Green's resuscitation, which concentrates the reader's attention on the physician's skill. And of course, the unspoken truth behind this account is that William Petty was able to revive Green because of the knowledge he had acquired by carrying out other dissections. So, for example, he would have known the structure of the lungs, he would have known the structure of the throat, the larynx, and the probable effects of strangulation, hanging by strangulation. And here we see Green becoming an example of the physician's skill. Her body is the object of experimentation and scientific study. And you can see here on this slide, I've detailed some of the measures that were taken to revive her, warming her with hot and cordial spirits, rubbing and chafing her hands, measuring her pulse, worried about residual swelling in her face or having a fever. So they bled her, which was standard practice. If you were worried that somebody was going to get a fever, they ordered a julep, yet another medical decoction. They applied clysters and cataplasms to try and reduce the bruising, and so on. And they record the effects of their treatments and the progress of her symptoms. The language here is very much in accordance with Thomas Spratt's strictures in the History of the Royal Society, and rejects all amplifications, digressions, and swellings of style, bringing all things as near the mathematical plainness as they can. Despite such care in discourse and the explicit demonstration of the most innovative medical knowledge and practices in early modern Britain, the writer of News from the Dead can't quite let go of a much older narrative of divine intervention. And from this perspective, Green's story is a signal act of God's mercy and providence, in which the physicians play their part as God's instruments. As such, a revived body is a much greater wonder than her dissected one would ever have been. And although the providential wonder story is older, nevertheless, in News from the Dead, Green stands alone as a present example of God's providence, and she isn't explicitly linked to any kind of rhetorical or literary archetypes or antecedents. She is, the readers should understand, a new miracle. In this, the physicians are divine agents, and their story, interweaved with Anne Green's story, work together to right injustice. Green's rhetorical role here is to be an example of authentic innocence of the crime and authentic penitence for her sexual sinfulness. This is achieved through the description of her demeanour and the recording of her words. The key here is consistency and integrity. Now, when Green recovered sufficiently to speak about her experience, she spake very sensibly, so she's regained her senses and maintained her pre-execution insistence on her innocence. That is really important, the consistency of her story. She's compared to a clock whose weights had been taken off a while and afterwards hung on again. The crucial issue in deciding and proving her innocence was whether the baby was miscarried or murdered. Through rational, medically based argument involving intimate details about Green's menstruation, the writer proves that the fetus, not above a span in length, was miscarried, and also that Green could have been unaware that she was pregnant, hence on both accounts she was innocent. However, should any doubts remain, the writer also records the sudden death of Sir Thomas Reed 3 days after Green's execution. You'll remember that Sir Thomas was Green's employer and the dead baby's great-grandfather. The inference is that Sir Thomas's death should be read as divine retribution for his insistence on prosecution and hence further proof of her innocence. Although in News from the Dead, even in this book, based so clearly on rational argument, the author finds himself unable to comment. At the end of this prose account, the writer finally balances the claims of medical skill and divine intervention in ensuring Anne Green's survival. It ends with some scepticism about any providential explanation of Green's survival, but with certainty that the foul stain of murder and by implication that of sexual transgression have both been erased. On the page facing this paragraph, the poems start. The very first poem in this collection is called On She That Was Hanged and Afterwards Recovered, and characterises Green as Verbia, and I've transcribed the poem for you here. Verbia, and you can see that in the fourth stanza, but short will spoil her marriage day, for who so hardy to essay such an immortal Verbia. Verbia is the feminine of Verbius, which means literally twice a man. And this was one of the names given to Hippolytus. Hippolytus, the myth of Hippolytus, I'll tell you a little bit more out in a minute, but he was the son of Theseus, the king of the ruler of Athens. Linking Anne Green to Hippolytus is something that the young poetasters of Oxford do repeatedly. In other poems, she is called Hippolytus revived in every part, and twice a maid, as he is twice a man. And you'll see also in this poem that her story is linked to the story of Orpheus, who was sent down, given leave to go down into the underworld to try and rescue his wife, Eurydice. So she is very much being tied now, not into a narrative of divine providence of the Christian God, but now going much further back and trying to link her story to classical antecedents. What is it about the example of Hippolytus that resonates so with these young men? You can see here on this slide that there's a definition here, or a summing up of what the Hippolytus' story is all about by Sir Thomas Elyot in 1538. And it declares here that Hippolytus, the son of Theseus, who at the complaint of Phaedra, his stepmother, was pursued by his father, and he in a chariot flying was overthrown among the sharp stones and rent all to pieces. Afterwards, Aesculapius revived him. Aesculapius was a healer, a doctor, and restored him to health. Wherefore he would be called Verbius, that is to say, twice a man, or as much as he had twice lived. It's important to fill in a few details for you about this story, which I think are very important for interpreting why this figure may be so important to the young men who are writing these poems. The complaint Phaedra made against Hippolytus was one of rape. He was famed for his chastity and his dedication to the goddess Artemis, and Phaedra's complaint against him was a false one. This example, the example of Hippolytus, the story of Hippolytus, is a conflation of different versions of his story. And these Oxford students would have known those stories. They can be found in Euripides, in Seneca, and Ovid, as well as Virgil. Ostensibly, this story is resonant because of the skill of Aesculapius, acting as an example for the skill of the Oxford physicians, flattering them and placing them in a rhetorical tradition of miraculous recoveries. It also engages the reader with the idea that if Anne Green's, like Hippolytus's life, is restored, then so was her chastity. However, as you can see, behind this assurance also lies a partially buried narrative of sexual slander. Could there be a suggestion that the lewdness of Sir Thomas Reed's house, referred to by Anne Green herself and also appearing in the reports in Mercurius Politicus, indicates that she was the victim of sexual assault? Using Hippolytus as an example of Green's resurrection would appear to restore her to those safe characters of early modern femininity. If she is once again maid, she can then become wife. But the characters, the actual characters used to write the newly restored Anne Green, the characters that make up the word Verbia, visibly trouble gender boundaries. Because this word doesn't literally mean twice a maid. Instead, it actually means twice a man turned into a woman. Hence, I think the suggestion in the poem that her new status is threatening, it's a brave man who would essay this strange wench and her at least figuratively restored hymen. Michel Le Doeuf writes of the sous-sol, the subsoil or basement of knowing, to describe the intuitive grasp of knowledge that involves hearing echoes of other voices rather than the observation of empirical evidence. Tying Anne Green to the example of Hippolytus perhaps reveals the narratives lurking in the sous-sol of these young poets' imaginations, and certainly allows me to speculate about the tendrils that might be moving through the subsoil of literary illusion and rhetorical tradition. Finally, then, News from the Dead holds within its pages and narrative two linked but opposed ways of knowing Anne Green, scientific and literary. As another of the young poets suggests, logic might be considered to have died, were it not that the myth of Aesculapius and Hippolytus finds new life in Oxford in 1651 and allows readers to see that poetic figments are turned truths. Both of these ways of knowing restore Anne Green's character and are witness to the truth of resurrection. However, the title of this pamphlet, What News Exactly is Coming from the Dead, also suggests the idea of hidden knowledge. That Anne Green might just know more than the physicians and the students as a result of her extraordinary experience. At a crucial moment in the prose section of News from the Dead, the women attending her are ousted from the chamber, so that the gentlemen of the faculty can question her about her sense and apprehensions of what happened to her. It suggested that it was the women about her who might suggest unto her to relate of strange visions and apparitions, and that, as a result, Green might say, like Aeneas and Orpheus after their wanderings in the underworld, that she had seen fine visions, heard celestial music, or hellish howling. Now, in News from the Dead, she is recorded as speaking somewhat impertinently in response to this male interrogation, but this shouldn't be understood as an example of her attempt to overturn male authority by unfeminine behaviour, being impertinent. It means that what she was saying lacked pertinence. It wasn't relevant to their questions. And thus it's used as proof that she hadn't regained her mental lucidity and that her speech could not be trusted. Really interesting when you think of the efforts that other pamphleteers went to insist on both her mental lucidity and that her speech was coherent and should be listened to. Clearly, such visions have no place in scientific discourse, and it's preferable that Anne Green should be unable to recall anything rather than recalling the wrong thing. However, the writer of A Declaration from Oxford, does offer an account of the vision she said she saw as she hovered somewhere between life and death, and those included a garden of paradise and 4 little boys with wings. In that pamphlet, Green is allowed to speak from beyond the dead. In all the other accounts, she is not. Now, that does not necessarily mean that the account of her visions given in the Declaration isn't true. What it does mean is that there was a desire by the men of science to suppress that story, most obviously by associating such visions with maleficent female influence. In fact, it may be that Green's impertinent, that is, her irrelevant speech, was just such a description of her visions. The bringing together of scientific, poetic, and mythical examples in News from the Dead allows us to read a revolutionary historical moment at this exact midpoint of the century. On the one hand is the developing intellectual tradition that makes all experience subject to rational and scientific explanation. On the other, an older mythical narrative that accepts inexplicable divine intervention. Access to knowledge is gendered in terms of physical and intellectual space. Anne Green's body is taken to a room on the High Street in Oxford, which is not only a makeshift anatomy theatre, but also a meeting place for the invisible college of men who are at the forefront of Oxford's innovative scientific community. At a crucial moment in the story, when Green had recovered sufficiently to be questioned about her near-death experience, women were excluded from the room, so that knowledge not to be spoken of and possibly acquired through visions invisible to the living could be contained and suppressed. If thinking about how Anne Green was used as an example allows us to know Anne Green and her story, it also inspires questions about what exactly Anne Green knew. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed that lecture. Just to remind you of those questions that I asked very much at the beginning of the lecture, which you might be already thinking about. And I look forward very much to talking about this lecture with you and to listening to your questions and to trying to answer them. Thank you very much indeed.